Let's take a brief break from painting now and look at sculpture, architecture, and decorative arts in the late 19th century. We're going to encounter some very strange abstract sculpture in this unit, but not yet. Maybe because sculpture was not as susceptible to experiments with light and color, the sculpture of this period seems more traditional than its painting, and indeed continues to reflect a strong classical and Baroque influence. This statue is actually a grave marker. It was a monument to the wife of the author and historian Henry Adams, a member of the famous Adams political family in America. Clover Adams, the wife, suffered from depression and committed suicide by swallowing the potassium cyanide she used to retouch photographs. Adams asked the sculptor to think about how he could incorporate Buddhist imagery and themes, especially the state of nirvana, that is, the state of being beyond either joy or sorrow. Guanyin, the bodhisattva, remember bodhisattvas of compassion, was often portrayed as wrapped in a cloak, and that's an image that the artist picked up on. I've included a Chinese porcelain Guanyin from the Ming Dynasty by means of comparison. Now, your textbook includes no example of Edgar Degas' wonderful sculptures of dancers, but I just had to throw one in. While this sculpture seems more realistic than impressionistic, it did introduce a very important innovation that we'll see a lot more of in this unit. Degas dressed his sculpture in an actual tunic and a real satin hair bow, as artists would later call them found objects. Now, your textbook doesn't include any of Gauguin's sculptures either, but I think this wooden low-relief panel is a fascinating illustration of the femme fatale we're also going to see in symbolist and fin de siècle painting. That's my next lecture. So here we see a woman, according to Gauguin, whom a demon takes by the hand, facing the forces of temptation, symbolized in part as a small fox. By the way, the figure with a thumb in his mouth on the upper right is Gauguin. We're going to look more at primitive art in my next lecture, but Gauguin, should be noted, was influenced by Polynesian sculpture. I've included an example from the Marquesa Islands, which is one of the places where Gauguin lived during his sojourn in the South Pacific and is indeed where he died in 1903. Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, on the other hand, seems almost a throwback to the Baroque and to Hellenistic sculpture. Count Ugolino is a character in Dante's Inferno, shut up in a tower with his 4 sons to starve to death. I'm sure you'll recognize the resemblance to our favorite Hellenistic sculpture. Note, too, the characteristically Baroque pyramidal structure. I certainly hope the College Board will not ask you to identify this as 19th century as opposed to Baroque. They might. I haven't actually written the test yet, so I don't yet know. That treat is yet to come. But clearly the most important late 19th century sculptor by far was Pierre Rodin. Those of you who visited in San Francisco got to see a lot of Rodin sculptures. He's a real favorite. In this statue, you can see both the realist and the impressionist influence in Rodin's work. He strove, like the classical sculptors, like the Renaissance sculptors, like the Baroque sculptors, to capture musculature and movement realistically. Yet notice that his sculptures also reveal a fascination with the play of light on surfaces, which is, of course, what was preoccupying his contemporary artists, the Impressionists. Rodin is often described as the most important sculptor since Michelangelo. Others would probably say Bernini, but I'll leave that up to you. Certainly, Rodin was heavily influenced by Michelangelo's work, especially the unfinished slave statues, which I've shown here. This is Michelangelo, not Rodin. I probably should have labeled it. Rodin was especially impressed by the way the slaves seemed both imprisoned in and struggling to break free from the stone. Many of Rodin's sculptures also capture this quite deliberate, unfinished appearance. In fact, here you see the use of the unworked stone and the figures kind of emerging from it. This is one of Rodin's most famous and at the time most controversial sculptures. Here you see versions in both marble and cast bronze. Rodin also worked in plaster. The Kiss was part of Rodin's huge Gates of Hell project, which you saw, I hope, in the Khan Academy podcast, and again, some of you saw on the Stanford campus. Think, by the way, about just how tempted the College Board would be to compare Rodin's doors with, say, Ghiberti's, which strongly influenced Rodin, by the way. The influence of Michelangelo is clear here as well, as is Rodin's fascination with the erotic. So let's watch a brief video introduction to this work. The Kiss was originally entitled Francesca da Rimini, as it depicts the 13th century Italian noblewoman immortalized in Dante's Inferno. Notice a Dante theme here. Francesca was a real person. She fell in love with her husband's younger brother Paolo. According to the story, they consummated their relationship after reading the tales of Lancelot and Guinevere. The couple were discovered and killed by Francesca's husband. In the sculpture, the book can be seen in Paolo's hand. The lovers' lips do not actually touch in the sculpture, suggesting that they were interrupted and met their demise without their lips ever having touched. You probably never heard the story, but it would have been as familiar to a late 19th century French audience as the story of Romeo and Juliet is to us. So here you see two other artists' depictions of the tale. On the upper right, a drawing by the Romantic artist William Blake, and on the lower right, a painting by pre-Raphaelite Dante Gabriele Rossetti, an appropriate name, eh? But Rodin took a rather shocking liberty with his statue and again explored the femme fatale theme. Let's hear more of the video. And okay, I have to include Rodin's most famous sculpture. Rodin reproduced the thinker in many sizes and in different media, but I've included the rendition that appears in the Gates of Hell so you can see it in context. The thinker may have been, most people think it was, Dante himself, but there's some dispute over this. I mean, why would Dante be naked? It's something art historians are still arguing about. But here again you see Rodin's debt to Hellenistic and Renaissance sculpture, but also his unique, expressive style. This sculpture is not in your textbook, but it's one of my favorites, and Rodin considered it to be his greatest work. While Rodin never entirely abandoned realism, notice that in this statue, which is one of his later works, he displays his expressionist and symbolist side as well. So the rough cut features and the monumental size capture the energy and force of the subject in a way that a purely realistic and representational sculpture would not. And again, you see his debt to Michelangelo's slave statues. The robe, it's interesting to note, disguises as much as it reveals Balzac's body, and it draws attention to that oversized head. Now, Rodin was an expert in the human body, and he knew that he had made a head that was out of proportion to the body. It was a deliberate act, a symbol of Balzac's genius. That was where his greatness lay. So we're seeing some symbolist influence as well. We'll be talking about the symbolist in just a minute. I love this sculpture, and it's partly because I love the story behind it. So here it is. England's King Edward III, after a victory in the Battle of Crécy during the 100 Years' War, laid siege to Calais, while Philip VI of France ordered the city to hold out at all costs. Philip failed to lift the siege, and starvation eventually forced the city to parley for surrender. Edward offered to spare the people of the city if any 6 of its top leaders would surrender themselves to him, presumably to be executed. Edward demanded that they walk out of the city wearing nooses around their necks and carrying the keys to the city and the castle. So this was really an exercise in humiliation and domination. That's a true story, by the way, or at least accounts seem to indicate that it was. One of the wealthiest of the town leaders, Eustache de Saint-Pierre, volunteered first, and 5 other burghers joined with him. So these are real heroes. Saint-Pierre led this envoy of volunteers to the city gates. It was at this moment and this poignant mix of defeat, heroic self-sacrifice, and willingness to face imminent death that Rodin captured in his sculpture. By the way, this is scaled somewhat larger than life. Interestingly, although the burghers expected to be executed, their lives were spared by the intervention of Edward's wife, Queen Philippa. She was pregnant, and she persuaded her husband to exercise mercy because she claimed that death would be a bad omen for their unborn child. Rodin broke with tradition with his sculpture by placing his cast bronze sculpture on a low pedestal. He wanted to bring the Burghers face to face with the people of Calais to create a sense of, mutual recognition, identification. The town, by the way, had commissioned the work, but the town fathers did not like Rodin's sculpture. They were expecting something more Baroque, something more pyramidal, something more monumental. This was a little too human for their taste. So they put it on a high pedestal and banished it to a more remote corner of the city, but Rodin had the last laugh. It was placed back on a low pedestal in 1926 and moved to a place of honor in front of the town hall. And again, some of you saw a replica of this in Stanford. By the way, when I say replica, remember that when you have cast bronze and you have a model, you have actual Rodin sculptures. It's just another, it's like having a print, a signed print. It's actually another work by the artist. I haven't talked about a fight that was roiling the art world as the 19th century came to a close. The question was, what is the purpose of art anyway? One school, which was most prominently represented by the famous British art critic John Ruskin, was that art should be socially useful as well as beautiful. It should encourage morality. It should encourage contemplation of the beautiful. It should promote the use of beautiful objects in everyday life by ordinary people. The opposing school, represented and really led by the American Impressionist James Whistler, was that art was produced for art's sake. It did not have to justify itself in any way with social utility. And in fact, Whistler argued that true art did not serve a social purpose. And, many of his successors would argue that true art was socially disruptive. Art, Whistler accused, has become foolishly compounded with education. Our post-impressionist painters really straddled these camps. So Van Gogh, for example, had once been a Christian missionary, and although he lost his faith, he continued to see his art as designed to uplift and inspire his viewers. And he really saw color as a way to manipulate reaction to his paintings and moral understanding. Cézanne and Seurat certainly promoted a more scientific approach to painting and especially color, and were really encouraging their viewers to engage in inquiry. But the most prominent and important proponents of socially useful art really turned out to be those engaged in the decorative arts. I guess that's not surprising. Those are arts that we use. They rebelled against what they saw as the soulless uniformity of the machine age and the way that the industrial processes alienated workers. That's an important term, alienated workers from their own product. By the way, Marx used that term as well. They wanted to restore what they saw as a medieval standard of craftsmanship in its beautiful items that also served a social, even a domestic purpose. This was art for the masses, but beautiful art for the masses. So one of the leaders of this movement was designer William Morris. He's particularly famous actually for his wallpaper, which you see here. This Morris design drawing room captures many elements of the arts and craft movement style, including geometric patterns, floral patterns, a bright and sort of pure-hued color. And by the way, the designers of the arts and craft movement were closely allied with the pre-Raphaelite painters that we saw in the last unit, and they shared a taste for these bright colors, intricate patterns, and a rejection of what they saw as soulless modernity. And again, Ruskin was a figure associated with both groups. But not all arts and crafts designers entirely rejected modernity. Some embraced clean, simple geometric lines, and these would reappear in the Bauhaus movement, which is really kind of a continuation of the arts and crafts and what we'll see in a minute, the Art Nouveau movements. So stay tuned. Here's an example. I really think there are an awful lot of labels in this course, but they're in your textbook, show up on the exam, so I am thrusting them at you. Art Nouveau is really a continuation, building on the idea of the arts and crafts movement. But the Art Nouveau artists were somewhat more willing to embrace new materials in the industrial age. In particular, they were intrigued by the properties of metals. So like the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, Art Nouveau designers were heavily influenced by the simplicity, clean lines, and bold colors of Japanese woodblock prints, but they also loved shapes from nature, particularly twining plants, curves, So they were not the geometric straight line folks. You should recognize the flattened perspective and strong line, the influence of Japanese woodblock prints in this drawing by Aubrey Beardsley. But note the sweeping curves, the twining platforms, the intricate patterns. These are more characteristic of Art Nouveau. Beardsley was also heavily influenced by the fin de siècle emphasis on eroticism and decadence. In fact, I debated whether I should put this drawing into the painting lecture that you're going to hear next or to insert it here. Painting, sculpture, and architecture were all interrelated. In many ways, the divisions of sections in your textbook and in my lectures are arbitrary. These folks talked to each other and looked at each other's works. So here's a classic Art Nouveau marriage between naturalistic forms, again you see those twining plants, and the new materials of the industrial age. I think this is really kind of a cool room. Many Art Nouveau artists and designers worked in stained glass. If you think about it, it's a medium that was well suited to their taste for intricate designs, for plant designs, their love of bright, pure hues. The textbook doesn't include any Tiffany lamps or Tiffany stained glass windows. By the way, the Tiffany exhibit at the Met, you've heard me advertised the Met before, is really spectacular. But at any rate, Tiffany's lamp screens and windows are among the most characteristic Art Nouveau works. And anyway, I love them. The lamp on the right, by the way, the one on the left is from 1910 as it's labeled, but the one on the right is just from a few years ago. So this is a living tradition. The Tiffany Glass Company is alive and well and still producing art. I kind of like that. Okay. Oops. Now we travel to Oz. We covered the 19th century architectural revival movements, Gothic revival, Neoclassical revival, the Beaux-Arts, a kind of Baroque revival in Paris in the last unit. And we're going to look at the groundbreaking Bauhaus movement when we get to the 20th century pretty quickly. But there are a couple of other late 19th century architectural developments that I want to address here. While the Spanish, or actually Catalan, Gaudi is usually classified as Art Nouveau, I think he's really a standalone figure. No other architect is quite like him. And as I was indicating in the beginning, to my mind, he's the architect from Oz. Gaudi was influenced, it's true, by the Gothic revival movement. You can see some of the Gothic elements in this famous church of the Sagrada family in Barcelona. He obviously took the Gothic revival in very new directions. Surrender, Dorothy. This church was his first major commission, and it remains his most famous work, although mysteriously it does not appear in your textbook. This work has elements of symbolism and fantasy. There are a profusion of exotic plant-like ornamentation that show his debt to Art Nouveau. The vision remains highly personal and more than a little bizarre. I was really pleased that Khan Academy had a video on this work, and I hope you took a look at it. This is the sort of thing it's much better seen in a video than in slides. But nevertheless, here's another slide. This is the roof of the nave from the Church of the Sagrada Familia. Again, Gothic revival meets the Wizard of Oz. Now, this work does appear in your textbook, and it's appeared on AP exams. In designing this apartment building, Gaudi was trying to create an organic structure using curves rather than straight lines. And notice those twisting chimneys on the right. I think those are very cool. He designed iron decoration that was shaped like lush exotic vegetation. This is probably why, more than anything else, he gets labeled as Art Nouveau. So he wanted his building to look as if it had been planted and grown from the ground. He wanted the stone to look like natural rock formations. And the effect is wonderfully weird. Again, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, the Cowardly Lion, and Dorothy, I think, would all feel right at home here with the wizard. In its own way, the Eiffel Tower is wonderfully weird too, but it makes no effort to imitate nature. Instead, it is a monument to modernity and modern metals. The building materials that allowed buildings to soar skyward. Usually the metal in buildings was an internal skeleton, but during this period there was a lot of experimentation with exposed metal construction, basically showing the building skeleton. You saw an example of a library roof in our last unit. No example is more famous than this one. But the greatest impact of the new building technology, in particular the use of metal and the invention of the elevator, was that it made the skyscraper possible. Very important, since cities were growing in population. You had to put those people and those businesses somewhere. Up was the most obvious direction to go. This building is considered to be the first masterpiece of skyscraper architecture. It wasn't the first skyscraper, but it was considered a design masterpiece. Sullivan, rather than disguising the building's verticality, because it's going to be a vertical building, it's a skyscraper, chose instead to emphasize it with these narrow columns of windows that draw our eyes up. But notice that Sullivan's skyscrapers were not just rectangular boxes stood on end. So he added elegant ornamentation, especially on the cornice that tops the building. You can see some details of the cornice here and also some interior details. I love the elaborately decorated elevators. They were really works of art. Here's Sullivan's own description of what he was trying to do. It must be every inch a proud and soaring thing, rising in sheer exultation. From the bottom to the top as a unit without a single dissenting line. Sullivan felt that a building's interior function should direct its exterior form, and he coined the now famous phrase, form follows function. In fact, excuse me, let me share the entire quote since it's quite poetic. Whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight, or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream at its base, the drifting clouds, over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function, and this is the law. We'll see more of that law when we move on to 20th century architecture or later 20th century architecture. Now, this was not a skyscraper. It was built with traditional masonry construction. And in some ways, this huge department store, again in Chicago, was built in the revival style. And what style would you say was being revived? This actually looks a lot like the Italian Renaissance palaces, the Medici Palace, for example, with its rusticated brick, its arched windows, and that decorative cornice around the top. Richardson, by the way, also designed Boston's Trinity Church, which shows some Romanesque features as well, and is just a really famous American landmark. And finally, here's another Louis Sullivan building, one of my favorites. I lived in Chicago for 11 years and went by this building frequently. I worked not far from it. So notice the elaborate ironwork on the entry level and the curve that sweeps around the corner. When we lived in Chicago, there was a gracious Louis Sullivan house just a few blocks away from where we lived in Hyde Park near the University of Chicago. I used to walk my dog, my earlier dog, just to admire. But tour buses stopped there all the time, and they weren't really stopping to admire Louis Sullivan's architecture. It was actually a very classic house, not a particularly modern construction. What they were stopping to admire was the boxy, interestingly shaped garage. It was built by Sullivan's bright young assistant, a fellow named Frank Lloyd Wright. Again, stay tuned.